Hey guys, welcome back to Dreamless Timelines. Tonight we're sinking into one of the most quietly disastrous stories in world history. So go ahead, dim the light, pull up a blanket, and let's drift slowly into the long, sleepy unraveling of the Qing Empire. A story that starts with confidence, slides into denial, and eventually melts into the soft, sticky mess of imperial collapse. And of course, because it's history, everything starts with someone thinking they're way smarter than everyone else. So let's float back to the early 1700s, when China was basically the final boss of global civilization. The Qing emperors sat on a throne that was enormous, rich, and honestly, a little too sure of itself. They ruled over hundreds of millions of people, commanded huge armies, and believed China didn't need anything from anyone. Not technology, not trade, not Western ideas, definitely not deals with merchants who wore weird wool hats from the other side of the world. China was the center of the universe, at least according to China. And honestly, it kind of was. Tea, porcelain, silk, spices. Europe wanted all of it. China, on the other hand, wanted silver. Just silver, not clocks, not telescopes, not European fashion, just shiny metal. And because of that, the silver started flowing east like a river with no brakes. European merchants hated this. They were basically paying China to let them exist. And Europe doesn't like that energy. So eventually, the British got an idea. A terrible idea, but also, unfortunately, a very effective idea. They introduced opium. Now, opium wasn't new. People had been smoking it, chewing it, and doing whatever else for centuries, but China didn't want it. Chinese laws banned it. Officials warned against it. Doctors said it wasn't great for your lungs, your brain, or your ability to show up to work on time. So, naturally, the British sold it. And not just a little. They dumped it into China by the ton. Picture a slow, lazy tide of wooden ships dropping off crates full of addiction while pretending they were doing nothing wrong. The British East India Company basically stood there like, oh wow, people really like this stuff. Who knew? Oops. And the Qing government watched their silver, their stability, and their ability to pretend everything was fine quietly dissolve. By the late 1700s and early 1800s, opium smoking was everywhere. Officials smoked it, merchants smoked it, farmers smoked it. Pretty much everyone except the emperor was lighting up, spacing out, and slowly destroying the productivity of an empire that once been a world superpower. And the irony, the Qing emperors still believed they were invincible. They truly thought, nah, it's not that bad. We're the Qing. We can't collapse. We're too big. You know, the usual famous last words of every collapsing empire ever. Meanwhile, the British were watching China fall into addiction like someone watching a slow, predictable car crash. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they didn't plan to stop. Because for the first time, the silver was flowing back west. Opium in, silver out. A perfect loop. Except for one problem. Eventually, someone in China finally said, okay, seriously, enough. And that someone was Lin Sexu. The guy was strict, stubborn, annoyingly honest, and absolutely not interested in being chill about the drug crisis. He marched into Canton like a frustrated parent cleaning up after teenagers who refused to stop vaping in the bathroom. He confiscated opium, he arrested dealers, he wrote angry letters to Queen Victoria like he expected her to respond personally, which she didn't, obviously. And then he made the mistake that would start a war. He destroyed the British opium stockpile. Imagine a giant pool, except instead of water, it's filled with drugs worth millions. Lin Zexu dumped it all into the sea like, there, problem solved. And the British went, wow, okay, you just destroyed our illegal drugs that we absolutely should not have been selling. Guess we're going to war now. Because of course they did. Empires love to double down on bad decisions. So began the First Opium War, a war China didn't want, didn't expect, and honestly wasn't even prepared for. The Qing military still fought like it was the year 1600, with swords, spears, and cannons older than half of Europe. The British, they had steamships, modern artillery, guns that didn't misfire every 10 minutes, and soldiers who were, unfortunately for China, very used to fighting wars far from home. It wasn't really a war. It was a slow, depressing beatdown. British ships glided along the Chinese coast, blasting forts like they were cardboard props in a school play. Qing generals sent troops who didn't even have matching weapons, and the emperor kept insisting everything was fine, even though the British Navy was basically parking itself wherever it wanted like it had VIP access. Finally, China surrendered, because it had to. The Treaty of Nanjing followed, one of those documents history teachers call unequal treaties, which is a polite way of saying China got absolutely nothing out of this deal. Hong Kong was handed over, ports were forced open, more opium came in, and the emperor was left pretending it was all part of a master plan. But it wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Opium addiction skyrocketed. Corruption spread. Officials started smoking during meetings. Farmers stopped farming. Soldiers stopped caring. And the dynasty that once ruled the largest population on Earth slowly rotted from the inside. The British watched, Europe watched, and China kept insisting everything was under control, even though everyone could see the cracks widening. And that's where we're going to pause for a moment. Let the story breathe and drift deeper into the long, sleepy collapse of the Qing Empire. Because this is just the first layer, the quiet unraveling. The part where everyone pretends things are still okay. But in the next part, we'll float into the rebellions, the warlords, the chaos, and the emperors who were way in over their heads.
So, let's drift back in. The First Opium War was over. The treaties were signed, and on paper, it probably looked like the crisis had been handled. But in reality, it was like putting a thin bandage on a wound that went straight to the bone. China didn't just lose a war. It lost the illusion that everything was still the way it used to be. And illusions, once broken, don't fix themselves. Life in the Qing Empire after the war felt off. People wouldn't say it directly, because criticizing the emperor wasn't a great career choice, but you could feel it in the air. Like the empire had taken a deep breath, held it, and forgot how to exhale. Opium kept flowing in, quietly, steadily, like a tide you can't turn back. Before the war, addiction was a problem. After the war, it became a lifestyle. Officials who were supposed to collect taxes drifted through their work in a sleepy haze. Soldiers lit pipes during patrols. Merchants smoked while counting their coins, losing track halfway through, and starting over again like nothing happened. And all of this built up into a strange national mood, a kind of slow-motion exhaustion, the kind where no one is collapsing, but no one is fully awake either. The emperor at the time, Dao Guang, watched everything with a quiet, tight frustration. He wanted to fix it. He wanted to save the Qing. But wanting and doing aren't the same thing, especially when your entire administrative system is floating in opium smoke. So when Dao Guang died, the throne passed to his son, the Shangfeng emperor. And let's be honest, the guy inherited one of the worst possible starter packs a ruler can get. An addicted population, corrupt officials, foreign powers demanding treaty rights, and an economy leaking silver like a cracked jar. And as if that wasn't enough, something even worse was brewing. A rebellion. Not a small one, not a riot, but a full-scale, world record-breaking disaster known as the Taiping Rebellion. Now, calling it a rebellion almost sounds too simple. This thing wasn't just a political uprising. It was a whole separate universe. It started with one man, Heng Xiuquan, who failed the imperial exam so many times that the universe probably took pity on him and gave him a hallucination. He decided he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ. Yes, as in the literal sibling, because history never disappoints. He gathered followers, preached a new religion, and eventually built a massive army that marched through China like they were rewriting civilization. Cities fell, millions died, and while all this was happening, opium kept pouring through ports, turning the national crisis into something surreal. The Qing military tried to fight back, but they were stretched thin, underpaid, and usually half asleep from addiction. And the irony? The places losing the worst were often the same places that had been hit hardest by the opium trade. Foreign powers watched from the sidelines like they were enjoying a long, dramatic season of historical reality TV. Sometimes they helped the Qing a little, sometimes they helped the rebels a little. Mostly they helped themselves. And the emperor? He panicked. Understandably. He abandoned the capital, literally ran for his life, while the dynasty's most powerful officials scrambled to hold things together with duct tape and hope. One of the few Qing officials who actually stepped up was Zhang Gofan, a serious, disciplined man who probably would have lived a much calmer life if he had been born in literally any other century. He built a regional army from scratch, men who didn't smoke opium, didn't take bribes, and didn't run when things got messy. It took them more than 10 years to crush the rebellion. 10 long, blurry, chaotic years. By the time it ended, 20 to 30 million people were dead. Yes, million. More than many modern wars combined.
And the Qing Empire was left standing, but barely. Like a building that technically hasn't collapsed yet, but you really shouldn't lean on it. The Zhenfeng Emperor didn't last much longer. He died young. Stress, illness, exhaustion, pick your reason. And left behind a little boy who would become the Tongji Emperor. And because he was a child, the real power fell to the Empress Dowager, Cixi. Cixi is one of those historical figures people still argue about today. Was she brilliant? Was she manipulative? Was she trying to keep the Qing alive, or just trying to keep herself in charge? Honestly, probably all of the above. But one thing is certain. She walked into power at a time when everything was already on fire. The empire was weak. The treasury was empty. Foreign governments kept knocking on the door with new demands, and opium use was higher than ever. It's strange, really. Countries usually fall because of wars or invasions, but China's fall was more like slow drowning. Barely noticeable at first, but impossible to escape once you're deep enough. Cixi tried to enforce reforms, but every attempt was tangled in corruption, resistance, and the same old belief that China didn't need to change. The Qing court still imagined itself as the center of the world, even when the world had clearly moved on. Meanwhile, foreign powers kept carving up influence zones like they were sharing a giant cake. Britain wanted trade, France wanted missionaries protected. Russia wanted land. Japan wanted respect and more land. Germany wanted something to do, apparently. Each one pushed the Qing government a little more, and the empire bent and bent and kept bending. And through all this, opium stayed in the background like a persistent ghost. It wasn't the dramatic cause of every crisis, but it made every crisis worse. It slowed everything. It softened everything. It took the edge off discipline, energy, motivation, and confidence. All the things an empire needs to stay alive. If you walked through a Qing city in the mid-1800s, you wouldn't see a nation preparing to collapse. You'd see people living normal lives, markets selling food, children playing, families working. Nothing apocalyptic. But you'd also see something else. Opium dens. Not hidden in secret corners. Out in the open, men lying on bamboo beds, pipes balanced in their fingers, staring into nothing with calm, empty expressions. And that was the mood of the empire. Not screaming, not fighting, just slowly drifting into numbness. A numbness the world would soon take advantage of. That's where we'll pause again. Let the story settle. Because the next part, we're going into the late Qing period, a time when the empire is technically alive, but every foreign nation is circling like they're waiting for the lights to go out.
Let's drift back into the late Qing world, a place where things looked calm on the surface, but underneath, everything was quietly coming apart like an old silk sleeve. By the time the mid-1800s turned into the late 1800s, China was in this oddly sleepy phase. Not peacefully sleepy, just tired, worn out tired. Like an old man trying to read the newspaper but slipping into a nap every 5 minutes. The government still functioned, technically. Officials still wrote reports. Courts still issued orders. Taxes still got collected. Well, some of them. But the spark was gone. The confidence was gone. The sense of, we are the greatest empire on earth, yeah, that was fading like cheap ink in the rain. Everyone knew it. No one said it. And foreign nations? They definitely knew it. Britain, France, Japan, Russia, Germany, the United States, they were all walking into China like customers entering a store where everything was on discount. Ports, railroads, mines, trading zones. Everybody wanted a slice. And the Qing court kept agreeing because, honestly, they didn't have many options left. They were tired. They were broke. And opium had made the national willpower feel like soft noodles. Even the way foreign diplomats behaved in Beijing had changed. They weren't respectful guests anymore. They were more like demanding landlords. They would walk into meetings with these calm, polite, very confident faces. The kind of confidence you only get when you know the other person can't say no. Inside the Forbidden City, the atmosphere was just as strange. Imagine a palace that once controlled half of Asia, now mostly worried about paperwork, etiquette, and which official was secretly taking bribes this week. And in the middle of all this, there was the Empress Dowager Cixi. She wasn't a warrior, she wasn't a reformer, she wasn't a visionary, but she was a survivor. A political chess player who could see 5 moves ahead, even when the chessboard was on fire. She understood something most other nobles didn't, that the Qing Dynasty was running out of time. But every attempt to modernize the empire bumped into the same wall, tradition. The dynasty was so used to doing things the old way that any time someone suggested change, the government reacted like someone had tried to replace their tea with cold water. Shock, offense, immediate refusal. Meanwhile, the world outside was speeding up. Electricity, steamships, modern rifles, telegraphs, railroads. Foreign nations loved railroads, by the way. Not because they cared about Chinese travel comfort, but because railroads made it easier to move troops and resources. Convenient, right? So whenever China struggled to build railroads, foreign nations offered to help, very generously, almost too generously. Loan money here, a treaty there, a small rights concession in return. And that's how little pockets of foreign control started appearing all across China, like scattered puzzle pieces owned by different players. And through all of this, opium continued quietly in the background. Not as dramatic as a war, not as loud as a rebellion, just steady, reliable, a constant dull drain. People never stopped smoking. Officials never stopped depending on it. Smugglers never stopped shipping it. Even after China technically legalized opium under foreign pressure, it still remained a shadow force, shaping things in slow, subtle ways. Imagine trying to run a government where a huge number of your officials are functioning at 70% of their energy on a good day, where military officers lose focus, where soldiers aren't alert, where paperwork gets delayed because the guy in charge is taking an afternoon smoke break that lasts 3 hours. That's what the late Qing Empire was dealing with. Not chaos, not explosion, just slow decay. But the world was not slowing down for China, especially not Japan. Japan had modernized aggressively, almost angrily, like they were speed-running the Industrial Revolution on max difficulty. And when they looked at China, they didn't see a big brother anymore. They saw an opportunity. So came the first Sino-Japanese War. China expected to win because, they used to be the central power of Asia. Instead, Japan wiped the floor with them. The military losses were bad. The humiliation was worse. Foreign nations saw what happened and basically said, "Oh, China can't protect its own coastline? Cool, let's grab more stuff." And they did. New treaties, new leases, new rights. China didn't collapse at once. That would have been almost merciful. Instead, it got pulled apart slowly like a dumpling being stretched until the filling leaks out. Inside Beijing, the mood got more paranoid, more brittle. Every official meeting felt like a quiet argument about how much tradition they could keep and how much reality they could ignore. And then came the Boxer Rebellion, a strange moment when ordinary Chinese, angry, desperate, frustrated, rose up and decided that the best way to fix foreign interference was martial arts and magic charms. Yeah, not the ideal strategy. They believed bullets wouldn't hurt them. Foreign weapons disagreed. Foreign armies marched in, Beijing got invaded, the Qing court fled again. And after everything ended, the empire was forced to pay massive reparations that trained the treasury even more. The irony was almost painful. A dynasty that once ruled proudly, now paying rent to foreign nations. And under all this, the quiet, sticky presence of opium remained. Not as dramatic now, more routine, but still there. Still weakening the system, still making every crisis hit harder. By the time the 20th century arrived, China felt like an ancient machine that used to run smoothly, but now needs 10 people to crank the handle just to keep the gears moving. No one admitted the dynasty was dying, but everyone could feel it. The streets were crowded with new ideas: nationalism, democracy, republicanism, reform, revolution. Students debated politics in tea houses. Newspapers criticized officials. People started asking questions the government didn't want to hear. And the old empire, the one built on Confucian order, imperial rituals, perfect harmony, felt more and more like a relic sitting in a museum that hadn't been built yet. All of this was the long echo of opium. Not the dramatic flood, not the explosion, but the slow erosion. Year after year, weakening resolve, draining money, dulling alertness, feeding corruption, and making the empire vulnerable to every pressure from the outside world. The stage was set. The dynasty was staggering. The world was watching, and a new century was about to walk in and ask a simple question. Can the Qing Empire survive modernity?
Let's drift back into the early 1900s. A moment when the Qing Empire was still standing, technically, but it felt more like the last candle in a drafty room, fighting to stay lit even as the world kept blowing on it. China had survived rebellions, invasions, humiliations, and loans so large that even modern accountants would need a nap halfway through the paperwork. But by the new century, something different was in the air. A kind of restless energy, a low hum rising under the surface. People were tired of watching the empire bend, pay, apologize, and compromise. Tired of watching their nation get carved into spheres of influence like it was a giant pie that everyone else got to eat first. And although no one said it out loud, the idea that the Qing Dynasty might not survive was no longer unthinkable, just quietly possible. Inside the Forbidden City, things looked calm in the way old rooms looked calm. Elegant, beautiful, but untouched for too long. There were layers of tradition everywhere, like heavy curtains blocking out the sunlight. Ceremonies still happened. Officials still kneeled. Reports still came in with impossibly polite language. But the weight of it all felt different now. Less like authority, more like inertia. Cixi was still the real power at this time. Older, sharper than ever, and still playing the political game like someone who refused to lose simply because everyone expected her to. But even she couldn't freeze time. Foreign loans grew heavier. Railroads, telegraphs, factories, all symbols of a world speeding toward modernity, kept threading themselves through China, often controlled by foreign powers who used business the way empires used swords. And the Qing court? It tried to keep up, just slowly. Late reforms were attempted, legal reforms, school reforms, military reforms, but they were like trying to rebuild a ship while it was already sinking. A brave effort, but not a realistic one. Meanwhile, the opium problem hadn't magically disappeared. The government tried to ban it repeatedly. Every time they banned it, millions ignored them. Every time they punished it, corrupt officials took bribes and let it pass. Opium was no longer a crisis, it was a habit, a quiet sigh, a quiet resignation. If the 1800s were the century of crisis, the early 1900s became the century of, we really need to fix this, but also, maybe later. And then came a little boy, a toddler really, someone who would become the face of the empire's final chapter, Puyi, the last emperor. He was chosen not because he was brilliant or talented or capable. He was chosen because the imperial bloodline had run out of better options. They carried him into the throne room when he was just a child, and he cried the entire time, which is honestly a pretty fair reaction for anyone being told they're now responsible for an empire that's falling apart. Puyi was too young to rule, of course, so the real power shifted again to regents, relatives, court advisors, people who were not united, not coordinated, and not particularly good at dealing with a modern world. While the palace clung to rituals, the streets of China were changing. Students studying abroad came home with new ideas: republics, elections, constitutions, science, Western philosophy, Japanese modernization.
Coffee house debates became louder. Newspapers became bolder. People started asking dangerous questions. Why do we still have an emperor? Why do foreigners control our railways? Why are we paying reparations for wars we lost decades ago? Why are we still following rules written for a world that no longer exists? The Qing court didn't have answers, not satisfying ones. not modern ones. And every year, the emperor's authority felt thinner, lighter, more symbolic, almost like a decorative stamp no one really respected except out of habit. Then came 1911, a year when China finally exhaled. Revolution didn't burst out dramatically, it flickered up in small sparks. Local uprisings, mutinies, student protests, each one small by itself, but together, enough to tip the balance. When the revolution spread, the Qing Dynasty didn't really fight back. Not with the old fury, not with the old confidence. They negotiated, they compromised, they stepped aside piece by piece. It wasn't a dramatic fall, it was a slow sit-down. A tired empire finally admitting it didn't have the strength to stand up anymore. Puyi abdicated before he was even old enough to tie his own shoes properly. The Forbidden City stayed intact, but the empire behind those red walls dissolved into the air like morning fog. And that was the official end of the Qing Dynasty. A 268-year-old empire slipping out of existence with more sighs than screams. But the real ending, that's deeper. Because the dynasty didn't fall from one event. It didn't collapse from one rebellion. It didn't break from one war. It faded. Quietly. Steadily. Softly. Opium didn't strike the killing blow. It just kept the empire too numb to defend itself properly. A slow, sticky drain on the national pulse. Not dramatic, just persistent. Foreign pressure didn't invade all at once. It pressed, and pressed, and pressed, until the walls gave way. Internal corruption didn't explode. It seeped in like water through cracked tiles. And when you add all of that together, you get the quiet fall of one of the world's greatest empires. Not a heroic tragedy, not a glorious defeat. Just a long, tired fading. History often loves drama, but the Qing Dynasty, its final act was a whisper, a soft exit, the kind where everyone turns around afterward and goes, "Oh, so it's over now." That's where we pause again. Let the story settle in the background of your mind. Because in part 5, we drift deeper into how opium carved a permanent scar across China, socially, civically, politically, long after the dynasty was gone. Whenever you're ready, we'll float there.
So now we drift into the quieter, more insulated world of the Qing imperial court. And by quieter, I mean completely detached from reality, like a bubble floating above a burning city, pretending the flames are just warm candlelight. In the early 1800s, the Forbidden City had basically become a palace-sized nap zone. Officials moved slowly, decisions moved slower, and the emperor often moved the least. The older the dynasty got, the more it felt like everyone in charge preferred avoiding problems rather than solving them. It was like watching a group project where all the members were waiting for someone else to volunteer, except nobody ever did. The Daoguang emperor inherited the opium mess, but had no idea how deep the rot was. He knew opium was bad, he knew people were addicted, he knew silver was disappearing. But he also knew that every solution came with a risk. And if there was one thing late Qing emperors hated, it was taking risks. So he tried partial bans, halfway enforcement, and letters that sounded strict but were basically soft reminders. It was like telling your kid, "I'm serious this time," after the 17th warning. Most court officials acted the same way. They wrote long memorials about the moral dangers of opium, about how it corrupted the soul and weakened the nation. But then many of them quietly smoked it themselves. So their reports read like essays written by students who didn't believe a single sentence but needed a good grade. Outside the palace walls, the crisis was getting worse, but inside, time moved differently. The emperor spent hours reading reports about regions he'd never visit. He'd sip tea while governors panicked miles away. The palace rituals continued unchanged. The ministers bowed, the eunuchs bowed, everyone bowed to everyone. There were days when more time was spent on ceremony than on national strategy. The contradiction was almost soft enough to be hypnotic. On one hand, the empire still imagined itself as the center of the world. On the other hand, everyone knew things were slipping, but nobody wanted to say it out loud, because saying it meant accepting it, and accepting it meant doing something, and doing something meant taking responsibility. And responsibility was unpopular. Meanwhile, British merchants were making insane profits. Opium farms in India kept expanding. Smuggling routes into China grew like stubborn vines. Local officials begged the capital for help, but the messages got buried under layers of bureaucracy. If an urgent report didn't fit ritual protocol perfectly, it was set aside for later review. Some of those later reviews happened years after the sender had already died. Let's drift over to the scholars for a moment. They were writing essays about loyalty, virtue, and order, while the actual order of society was falling apart right behind them. Many still believed moral discipline alone could fix everything. If everyone just behaved better, smoked less, followed Confucian ideals more strictly, then maybe the empire could return to its golden days. It was wishful thinking dressed as philosophy. And yet, in this sleepy atmosphere, one man finally stood out, Lin Zexu. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't revolutionary, he was just annoyingly honest in a system that preferred gentle lies. When he said opium should be destroyed, he meant it literally. No loopholes, no exceptions, no half measures. It was refreshing and uncomfortable at the same time. At first, the emperor liked his energy. Assigning Lin Zexu to Guangdong felt like a safe decision, someone who would actually enforce the law, but far enough away not to disturb the calm of the Forbidden City. But even then, nobody predicted how serious he was. Not the British, not the merchants, not even the court. Looking back, it feels like the Qing court floated peacefully through these years, unaware that someone, somewhere, was about to poke the British Empire with a very sharp stick. And the British Empire did not enjoy being poked.
Hey guys, welcome back. If you're still awake, congrats. You've officially survived 5 parts of imperial mismanagement, collapsing economies, and a whole lot of British tea addiction. So let's drift back into the Qing Empire, where everything is technically still standing, but only the way a tired old bookshelf stands, one kick away from total disaster. And yeah, that kick is coming, but we'll glide into it slowly, no rush. Because tonight, we're entering the part of the story where opium stops being a problem and becomes the bloodstream of the empire. Literally. The 1800s in China were basically one long, slow, painful sigh. Population exploding. Food not exploding. Government confused. Corruption thriving like it's running a pyramid scheme. And in the middle of all that, opium is just floating around, like a lazy smoke cloud that refuses to leave your room. Imagine a whole empire trying to stay productive while everyone from soldiers to scholars is just mildly high. Not chaotic high, just sleepy high. The kind where productivity becomes meth and time stops having meaning.
Qing officials kept writing reports saying things like, "Sir, the soldiers can't walk straight. Sir, the silver has disappeared. Sir, everyone seems a little too relaxed for a collapsing empire." And the emperor? He was just trying to meditate his problems away. Bless him. It wasn't working. By the 1820s, opium wasn't just a nuisance. It was the economy. Farmers were selling grain less. Landlords were demanding rent in opium pellets. And silver, the backbone of China's financial system, was pouring out of the country like someone left a faucet running. Britain wasn't even hiding it at this point. They were basically standing there like, "Hey, do you guys want more?" And China was like, "No, absolutely not. Give it here." Let's glide over to the countryside for a moment, because out here, opium was everywhere. Smoking dens popped up like mushrooms. Poor families were selling furniture, tools, even roofs. Not for food, not for clothes, but for another pipe. Imagine a farmer saying, "Should I eat today? Or should I transcend the earthly realm for 6 hours?" Guess which option won? Now, the Qing government did pass bans. Lots of bans. Year after year. Like clockwork. Stop smoking. Seriously, stop smoking. We are begging you, stop smoking. This time we're really serious. No, like really serious. It changed absolutely nothing. Because bans don't work when half the people writing the bans are high too.
Let's drift over to the coast now, to Canton, the only place foreigners were allowed to trade. Picture a crowded harbor where British and Indian ships are anchored, stuffed with crates of opium. Not medicine, not luxury goods, just giant floating drug warehouses. And every night, small Chinese boats would silently paddle out. Money goes one way, opium goes the other. Nobody talks, everybody knows. It's like the world's slowest illegal handoff, except it's not even really illegal anymore because everyone pretends not to see it. By this point, the British East India Company is basically printing money. They don't need silver to buy tea anymore. China is paying for its own addiction, a perfect loop. And the Qing Empire is watching its economy evaporate while trying to figure out how all this became normal. Spoiler, it became normal because no one had the energy to stop it. But not everyone was asleep at the wheel. Enter a new figure, quietly walking into the story, a man who actually cared, a rare creature in late Qing politics. We won't bring him in fully yet. We're just floating toward him. For now, just know, the empire's patience is thinning, its treasury is emptying, its dignity is melting, and opium is everywhere. The stage is set, the pressure is rising, and the British are about to find out what happens when a centuries-old empire finally decides to stand up, slowly, awkwardly, but still stand up.
Hey guys, welcome back. If you're still barely awake after 6 parts, that's honestly impressive. You deserve a medal. A very slow, very heavy medal. So tonight, let's gently drift into the next chapter of this long, calm disaster. Because China is starting to realize something important. You can only ignore a burning house for so long before someone finally says, "Hey, does anyone else smell smoke?" And that someone was Lin Zexu. Yes,
The one person in the entire Qing Empire who actually read the reports, looked at the numbers, listened to the exhausted soldiers, and said, "Wow, we are really messed up." Lin Zexu was one of those rare officials who didn't take bribes, didn't sleep through meetings, and didn't spend his nights at opium dens. Already an anomaly. Imagine the entire government as a giant, dusty, slow-moving machine, and then suddenly one gear wakes up and starts spinning like it actually wants to work. That was Lin. He had this radical idea. What if we actually stop the thing that's destroying us? Wild, right? Truly revolutionary thinking. So the emperor calls him in and says basically, "Hey, we need someone responsible. Everyone else is either too corrupt, too tired, or too high. Can you fix this?" And Lin, with the confidence of a man who has not yet seen British gunboats, says, "Yes, Your Majesty, I'll handle it." Bless his heart. He really meant it. When Lin Zexu reached Canton, he didn't walk in gently. He arrived like a tired parent entering a teenager's room. He opened the door, saw the mess, and went, "No, absolutely not. We are cleaning this right now." He shut down opium dens. He arrested Chinese dealers. He interrogated smugglers. He wrote long, beautifully worded essays explaining why opium was ruining civilization. And then he went after the British directly. Because by now, the British merchants were acting like they owned the place. They had warehouses full of opium, they had networks of smugglers, they had money pouring in faster than they could count it. And Lin Zexu just politely walked up and said, "Give me all the opium you have." Imagine someone knocking on Amazon's door and saying, "Hey, can you hand over your entire warehouse? I'm going to destroy it." That's basically what he did. The British merchants panicked. Their eyes probably twitched, their hands probably shook, because giving up their opium was basically giving up their fortune. They tried arguing, "Sir, technically this is our opium." And Lin answered, "Not anymore." He blockaded them inside their own living quarters. No food, no water, no ships leaving. Just pure bureaucratic pressure. It took weeks, but eventually the merchants broke. They surrendered. 20,000 chests of opium. Let me translate that into normal human language. An ocean of drugs. And Lin destroyed all of it. Every last drop. Dumped into pits, mixed with lime, washed into the sea. It was the most dramatic, "I've had enough" moment in Chinese administrative history. Meanwhile, back in London, politicians were sipping tea and reading the news like, "Wait, what? China destroyed our property? This is unacceptable. Mobilize the Navy because nothing says freedom like demanding the right to sell drugs." And this, my friends, is where the vibes of the story gently shift. Because the British Empire wasn't really known for subtlety, or humility, or self-reflection. They preferred gunboats. Big ones. Fast ones. Ones that could politely negotiate with cannon fire. So while Lin Zexu was feeling proud, maybe even relieved, thinking he saved his country, a fleet of iron ships was already heading toward China. Slowly, inevitably, like a stress headache traveling across the ocean. The First Opium War was approaching. But don't worry, we'll ease into it. No explosions, no drama. Just slow, methodical, imperial disappointment.
Hey guys, welcome back. If you're still listening at this point, I'm genuinely impressed. You're basically meditating on 19th century geopolitics at bedtime. Not many people can say that. So tonight, let's slowly drift into the part of the story where everything starts collapsing in that classic, oh no, but very slowly way. Because the Qing Empire was about to meet the British Navy, and the British Navy was very much in its Jim Bro era. Muscles everywhere, cannons polished, ego levels extremely high. Meanwhile, China was, well, still trying to figure out how to fix its paperwork. Remember Lin Zexu, the one competent guy? Yeah, he's still in Canton, feeling pretty proud of himself. He just destroyed enough opium to fill several swimming pools. He's writing letters to the emperor like, "Mission accomplished, country saved, you're welcome." But the British merchants send their own letters, and their letters say things like, "Dear Parliament, China hurt our feelings and also our drug money. Please send boats." And Parliament says, "Say no more, King," even though there was no king at the time, just vibes. So the British fleet sails out. Big ships with names like HMS Melville and HMS Wellesley, because, of course, every ship is named after some guy who looked like he smelled permanently of cigar smoke. They had cannons, they had rockets, they had sailors who hadn't slept properly in months. Perfect recipe for imperial outreach. China had wooden junks, some cannons that hadn't been cleaned since the last dynasty, and soldiers who were mostly here for the paycheck and the rice rations. So yeah, things were not looking evenly matched. But the wild part, the Qing court had no idea. They were still chilling in Beijing, reading reports that had been massaged, softened, edited, because no official wanted to be the guy who told the emperor, "Your Majesty, we're about to get steamrolled." So they wrote things like, "The foreigners are annoyed, but manageable. We have the situation under control. Our navy is fine." Spoiler, it was not fine. When the British ships arrived near Canton, they do a little demonstration, fire a few rounds, show off their firepower. Nothing too dramatic, more like a really aggressive product demonstration. And the Qing Navy responds by sinking itself. Not intentionally, just by existing in the line of fire. The British officers are like, "Wow, that was easy. Are we sure this is a war or not a light exercise?" Meanwhile, Lin Zexu is panicking. Not loudly, not dramatically, just in a quiet, "oh no, the emperor is going to blame me for everything" kind of way. He keeps sending letters north, explaining the situation, hoping someone will do something. But the court was busy arguing over things like cloak colors, ritual hierarchy, and who was allowed to sit closest to the throne. Classic palace priorities. And then the emperor does what stressed out emperors do. He fires the only guy who was actually working. Lin Zexu becomes the scapegoat. He gets exiled, sent to the far edge of the empire like a broken laptop being shoved into a drawer. China's one competent reformer has been removed from the board, which means the empire is now officially running on confusion, denial, and wishful thinking. The British forces move slowly up the coast, taking ports one by one, not because it was hard, but because bureaucracy takes time. Even imperialism has paperwork. Every city they capture sends shockwaves back to Beijing. But those shockwaves travel through several layers of officials, translators, scribes, and probably at least one guy who was paid to make problems sound smaller. By the time the emperor hears what's happening, the message is basically minor issue. Foreigners are being annoying, even though in reality they'd basically taken half the coastline. The war drifts on like a slow leak in a very large balloon. No huge battles, no epic speeches, just small, steady defeats piling up, like losing repeatedly in a video game tutorial. And the British? They're chillin', drinking tea, taking cities, negotiating terms that sound suspiciously like, "Give us whatever we want, or we'll keep gently bullying you."
Back in the Forbidden City, the emperor finally realizes this is bad, but it's too late for panic. The war is already unwinnable. No amount of ritual confidence or court etiquette could stop industrial age cannons. So, eventually, the Qing Empire starts thinking about surrender in the most dignified, slow, imperial way possible. And that soft, painful slide into negotiation.
Hey guys, welcome back. If you're still here, honestly, you deserve a medal, or at least a very long nap. Because tonight, we're drifting deeper into the part of the story where the Qing Empire slowly realizes it's losing a fight it didn't even understand. Classic Qing behavior. So let's just float back into the timeline, nice and slow. By this point, China is still pretending nothing serious is happening, like someone ignoring a leaking pipe by saying, well, it's not that much water. Meanwhile, the British Navy is outside, basically stretching like it's warming up before a gym session. Steamship's ready, cannons shiny, confidence level unhealthy. And up in Beijing, the emperor is finally getting messages that sound slightly less sugar-coated. Nothing too dramatic, just small hints like, Your Majesty, the foreigners are acting up, which is bureaucratic code for, we lost another port, but we don't want to get yelled at. Meanwhile, the British are sailing around the coastline in the most casual, unbothered way possible. It's not even war for them at this point. It's sightseeing with occasional cannon fire. Half the officers are probably thinking, nice weather today. Shall we conquer a city? Sure, why not? And the Qing commanders? They're trying their best, but their best is basically wooden ships, rusted cannons, and soldiers who signed up mostly because the rice rations were good. The technology gap is so embarrassing, it's almost cute. But the real comedy comes from the communication delay. By the time news traveled from Canton to Beijing, it had passed through so many layers of nervous officials that every disaster got translated into something soft and soothing, like turning "we are collapsing" into minor difficulties in the southern region. So the emperor's response is naturally to hold more rituals, pray harder, consult ancestors. Because when you're losing a naval war, obviously the solution is incense. Meanwhile, on the coastline, the British keep capturing forts so quickly they have time to make tea in between. There's no big dramatic battle, no heroic final stand, just a slow string of losses that feel like watching someone repeatedly trip over the same carpet. And remember Lin Zexu, the one competent guy? Yeah, well, he's gone now. Exiled. Probably staring at a mountain somewhere, wondering why excellence is always punished. China officially has nobody left who understands the situation, which means every decision now is made by people who think the British Navy runs on witchcraft. As the British push north, the Qing court finally starts connecting the dots. Not quickly, more like when you wake up slowly and realize your alarm has been ringing for 10 minutes. They start having emergency meetings where everyone is confused, accusing each other, and proposing extremely outdated solutions. Eventually, the emperor sighs the kind of sigh only exhausted emperors can sigh, and says the inevitable royal version of, okay, maybe we should talk. And that's where the story drifts next, into slow, reluctant negotiations, a tired empire, a smug British fleet, and the birth of treaties that would haunt China for decades. But we'll float into that in the next part.
Hey guys, welcome back. If you're still here, that means you've officially survived 9 full parts of 19th century political chaos, which honestly makes you more qualified than most Qing court officials at the time. So go ahead, get comfortable, maybe loosen the shoulders a bit. Because now we drift into the part where the situation starts to stretch. Not explode, not collapse dramatically, just stretch like old rubber that's been sitting in the sun way too long. At this moment, the Qing Empire was standing right at the edge of the First Opium War,
but still pretending it was just a minor disagreement with some annoying foreigners who refused to follow the rules. Classic imperial coping mechanism. If you ignore the storm long enough, maybe it'll politely leave. Meanwhile, the British weren't ignoring anything. They were in full expansion mode, checking their maps like, this coastline looks nice. It would be a shame if someone opened it for trade. Back in Canton, things were tense in that quiet, uncomfortable way where everyone knows the situation is bad, but nobody wants to be the first person to say it out loud. Lin Zexu, the one guy trying to clean up the mess, kept sending reports north, explaining exactly how serious the crisis had become, and Beijing kept replying with messages that basically said, "Got your letter, we will handle it. Please stop stressing." But they weren't handling anything. They were too busy dealing with internal paperwork, ceremonial schedules, petty power struggles, and the usual palace drama that somehow always felt more important than national survival. The British merchants, on the other hand, were extremely done with the situation. To them, this wasn't a cultural dispute or a legal disagreement. This was business. And in their minds, China had just messed with the revenue stream. So they started pushing Parliament, pushing their colonial administrators, pushing everyone with a title or a wig to take action. And the mood in London slowly shifted from annoyed to, okay, let's flex. Nobody wanted to admit publicly that the whole thing was about protecting a drug trade, so they called it defending British commercial rights, which sounds way cleaner. And so, as the pressure built, British ships started drifting closer to Chinese waters. Not in an aggressive movie-style approach, just slowly, casually, like they were taking a scenic route with cannons. China had no real navy waiting for them, just coastal defenses that had been outdated since before the United States even existed, and officers who were more focused on maintaining honor than maintaining ammunition. The reason things felt so slow was because everything had to pass through layers of bureaucracy. Reports took weeks. Orders took even longer. And half the time, the information got polished along the way so no one in the chain would look incompetent. So Beijing kept thinking the foreigners were being difficult, but manageable, while in reality, the situation was sliding into conflict like someone sleepwalking into traffic. The Emperor, Daoguan, was stressed, in that quiet, royal way where you sit still, drink tea, and pretend you're fine while everything falls apart outside your window. He didn't fully understand the threat because nobody dared explain the British Navy in realistic terms, and also because, honestly, he had no frame of reference. How do you prepare for steam-powered warships when your entire worldview is based on the idea that China is the center of the universe and everyone else is basically a side character? As the months passed, small incidents kept piling up. Arguments over trade, miscommunications, shots fired accidentally or accidentally. Each tiny spark added just a little more heat to the situation. Not enough to set a fire, but enough to make the air feel uncomfortable. And while all this was happening, opium addiction kept spreading quietly across China like a slow-moving shadow. Families were breaking apart. Labor was disappearing. Local economies were drooping under the weight of addiction. But the court treated it like an embarrassing problem no one wanted to talk about in front of guests. By this point, the British had made up their minds. They were going to force China open one way or another. And the Qing still assumed that a polite letter, a few scoldings, and maybe a ritual threat would keep the foreigners in line. They were living in two different centuries, two different realities. And that slow, drifting disconnect was exactly what pushed both sides toward a war they neither of them announced, but both of them felt coming. And that's where the story was settling as we slide into the next part, the moment just before the storm finally touches down, even though it arrives in the most quiet, boring, paperwork-heavy way imaginable.
So now we drift into the phase where the First Opium War actually begins, even though nobody involved ever stands up and officially says, "Hey guys, the war has started." It kind of just happens, like a slow-motion argument that becomes a breakup without anyone finishing a sentence. The British ships start moving along the Chinese coastline with that relaxed confidence of someone who knows they brought the bigger toys. Steam power, modern cannons, trained naval crews, and an absolutely unreasonable amount of tea, because apparently they needed caffeine to colonize half the planet. Meanwhile, the Qing Empire is still doing what big, slow empires do, filing paperwork, sending envoys, hoping the foreigners will get bored and go home. They weren't preparing for war, they were preparing for negotiations, because in their worldview, China didn't lose wars. China negotiated misunderstandings. But the first shots eventually happen anyway, in that awkward, accidental way where both sides pretend it wasn't supposed to happen, but neither side apologizes. The British fire a warning shot. China fires back, thinking it's a threat. Britain fires again, thinking China didn't understand the warning part. China panics, and suddenly the world's largest empire is in a fight with a navy that could basically delete it from the coastline. Nobody wanted this, but nobody could stop it either. The British ships, with their shiny steel cannons, cut through the traditional Chinese junks like they were punching holes in wet cardboard. Some ships literally fell apart before they even reached firing distance. Others tried to ram the British vessels with the kind of confidence only someone who has never seen a modern cannon can have. The British officers were honestly confused at how easy everything was. Some of them wrote in their diaries things like, "This cannot be called a war. It is more like a demonstration," which is basically Victorian English for, "Wow, this is embarrassing." And back in Beijing, they still didn't know the truth. The reports that reached the emperor were politely edited versions that said things like, "The barbarians were aggressive today, but we responded appropriately." Or, "Our navy performed with bravery, though the wind was not favorable." Or the classic, "We are evaluating the situation." All of these were technically lies, but soft lies, comforting lies, the kind of lies that keep your job safe for one more month. Lin Zexu, stuck in exile far away, kept hearing rumors of disaster. And every single rumor hurt because he knew this was exactly what he'd warned everyone about. He had written letters, essays, memorandums, full philosophical arguments explaining why the empire needed urgent reform. But the court liked the illusion of stability more than the reality of change. The British, on the other hand, weren't in a hurry. Taking a city wasn't a big achievement. It was Tuesday. They moved slowly, one port at a time, sending diplomats ahead with polite, professional letters that basically said, "Good afternoon. Please surrender, or we will continue shooting your buildings." They always kept it classy. As the fighting spread, regular Chinese civilians became trapped in the middle, confused, frustrated, and sometimes weirdly calm about everything. Because when you live under an empire for your whole life, you assume the empire will fix things. People went on with their daily routines, even while British soldiers wandered the streets of captured towns, politely asking for directions to the nearest customs house. It all felt unreal, too slow to be scary, too steady to be heroic. And the emperor, finally realizing the situation was slipping, began searching for someone to blame, which is the imperial version of problem solving. Dismiss a few officials, demote a few governors, write a very stern edict reminding everyone that loyalty is important. But none of this changed the reality outside the palace walls. The Qing Empire was losing. Not dramatically, not explosively, just gradually. A quiet unraveling. And the British Navy kept inching closer to the heart of Chinese power, taking advantage of confusion, slow communication, and the empire's total refusal to believe it was vulnerable. War, in this strange, drifting phase, didn't feel like a war at all. It felt like watching a giant wooden door slowly rot and fall off its hinges, piece by piece, while everyone inside pretends the wind is just a little stronger this year. And that gentle, tired slide toward defeat is exactly where the story now floats, before we drift into the next part, the moment when negotiations begin, treaties appear, and China's entire future quietly gets rewritten on paper.
So now we drift into 1841, the very cozy, very awkward part of the story, where the Qing Empire is losing the war, but still pretending it's totally fine. Kind of like when your phone battery is at 2%, but you keep telling yourself, yeah, I can make it home. The British have taken several ports. They're setting up temporary offices, drawing maps, doing that very British thing where they act polite while casually absorbing territories. And the Qing government is still struggling to understand what's happening. It wasn't denial. Okay, it was denial. But also confusion, because the Empire had never fought a war with a steam-powered navy before. They didn't even know what to call half the British technology. Some reports described steamships as fire-breathing ocean monsters, which honestly is a pretty fair description. Negotiations start in this weird, sleepy, back-and-forth rhythm. The British send envoys. The Qing send envoys. Everyone talks past each other. Everyone pretends to be in control. No one is actually in control. The British want open ports, free trade, money, territory, the usual shopping list. The Qing negotiators want peace, but without losing face, which was almost impossible because losing face was basically built into every British demand. So every meeting is the same vibe. Hello, let's reach a peaceful agreement where you stop attacking us and also we give you nothing. And the British respond with, cute idea. Anyway. Eventually, one frustrated Qing negotiator writes a letter saying, these foreigners have no concept of proper ritual. Which is true. The British were not here to bow 12 times and recite harmonious poetry. They were here to secure trade rights, so they could sell China more drugs. Now, the British weren't totally unified, either. Some commanders wanted harsh terms. Others preferred calm diplomacy, mainly because they were tired and wanted to go home. But the general mood was, yeah, we're winning. Let's just get this treaty done. China, meanwhile, keeps trying to buy time. Send new negotiators. Switch to softer language. Pretend the emperor is considering their request, but is very busy right now with important imperial matters. Probably calligraphy. The emperor himself is stressed. He hasn't left the Forbidden City in years. His only battlefield information comes in slow, censored, occasionally hand-wavy reports. Some say things are getting better. Others mention small setbacks. No one wants to tell him the truth because imperial anger was career-ending. Finally, the British capture a few more key positions, including places that shouldn't have been lost if the empire was truly in control. And at that point, negotiations shift from gentle disagreement to, yeah, you're signing whatever we put on the table. This is where the first version of the Treaty of Tronpi gets drafted, a sort of early, unofficial agreement, not finalized, but close. And the terms? Well, they were rough. China would give up Hong Kong, pay compensation, open a few ports, allow British merchants to operate freely. Basically, it was the start of modern globalization, but the unpleasant kind. Some British negotiators thought this treaty was too soft. Others thought it was too harsh. And in Beijing, they thought it was absolutely unacceptable. But they also couldn't stop it. The war had already written the outcome. The weirdest part is how calm everything felt. There were battles, yes, but mostly it was slow, distant, almost abstract, as if the empire was losing a chess match it didn't realize had begun. And so the story drifts toward the inevitable, toward the moment when the treaty becomes official, when foreign powers carve out influence, and when the Qing Empire, this massive ancient structure,
starts collapsing not with an explosion, but with a long, tired exhale. A quiet, reluctant surrender is where we float next.
So now we slide into the part of the story where the treaty actually becomes real. Or, well, as real as anything becomes in a war where half the reports are fake and the other half arrive 3 months late. The British are sitting comfortably in their occupied ports, sipping tea, polishing cannons, and writing letters home like, "Yeah, Mom, things are going great. Weather's nice. We conquered a coastline." Meanwhile, the Qing negotiators are doing their best impression of people who understand what's happening, even though they really, honestly don't. The draft treaty, the early version of the Treaty of Nanjing, moves through the imperial bureaucracy like a stubborn cat. Slow, irritated, leaving chaos in its path. Nobody wants to be the official responsible for delivering it to the emperor. Imagine being the guy who walks into the Forbidden City and has to say, "Hey, Your Majesty, remember that empire we've been bragging about for 200 years? Yeah, so, we need to give part of it away now." No one wanted that job. Not even for a promotion, not even for bribe money. So the paperwork bounces between departments like a cursed object. Everyone reads it, frowns, and quietly slides it onto someone else's desk. Outside the palace, the British fleet continues inching upward along the coast, not in a dramatic, heroic way, more like a bored Uber driver following a GPS route. Every city they approach sends panicked messengers inland. Every messenger arrives breathless, overwhelmed, and usually ignored. The emperor finally sees the draft. He studies it quietly, in that imperial way where silence is more dangerous than shouting, and he writes an official response that basically says, "This treaty is unacceptable. Absolutely not. Never." Then he adds a second note, but also send more negotiators and maybe stall a little, which is classic Qing diplomacy at this point. Say no, mean maybe, hope yes never becomes necessary. But time keeps moving, and the British don't slow down just because the emperor is thinking. So negotiations begin again, this time with more pressure, more urgency, and a lot fewer illusions. The British approach the table with that calm confidence of someone who knows they can blow up your walls, but chooses not to, for now. They restate their demands, slowly, politely, like a teacher explaining basic math to a kid who keeps insisting 2 + 2 = pineapple. The Qing negotiators try everything: flowery language, ritual etiquette, symbolic gestures, vague promises of future cooperation. None of it works. Industrial age cannons don't care about metaphors. The war drifts on. More ports fall. More rivers are blockaded. More Qing commanders surrender without even fighting. Not because they're cowards, but because they're realists. And with each silent loss, the balance shifts further. The emperor becomes more anxious. The court becomes more chaotic. Rumors fly around Beijing like mosquitoes in summer, annoying, everywhere, and impossible to squash. Meanwhile, foreign merchants are already imagining their futures in a newly opened China. More trade, more markets, more money, less resistance. And so the Qing Empire, this giant structure built over centuries, begins tilting, slowly, quietly, like an old wooden chair losing its balance. No dramatic collapse, just exhaustion, bureaucratic fatigue, a sense that the inevitable is already happening, even if nobody wants to say it. And that soft slide towards signing the treaty, the moment when China finally says, "Fine, whatever, we're done," is exactly what we drift into next.
So now we float into the moment when the Qing court finally realizes the truth. Not the polite, sugar-coated version filtered through terrified officials, but the actual, "oh, we're losing everything" realization. And it hits them not like lightning or a dramatic movie scene, but like someone gently tapping your shoulder at 3 a.m. to inform you that the house is flooding. Again. Reports keep arriving from the coast, and this time they're harder to soften. Cities lost, commanders surrendering, harbors blocked by ships that move without wind like giant metal spirits, and British cannons casually rearranging the landscape. The emperor reads these reports in an exhausted silence. He's not angry anymore, he's just tired. History really underestimates imperial fatigue. This man is running a 2,000-year-old bureaucracy powered entirely by paperwork and vibes. So he finally does what leaders do when they have no options left. He orders the negotiators to conclude peace, which is imperial speak for, okay, fine, just sign something before they take another city. The negotiators return to the table with the emotional energy of people heading into a dentist appointment they can't reschedule. The British envoys sit there patiently, sipping tea, probably thinking, this could have been done months ago, but sure, let's pretend this is a fresh conversation. The Qing side opens the talks with the same elegant phrases they've used since forever. Ritual greetings, poetic metaphors, respectful compliments. And the British respond with, anyway, about those ports we're taking. There's a beautiful cultural mismatch here. The Qing side tries to make the treaty sound honorable and balanced. The British side just needs signatures. Nobody is actually listening to each other. It's like two separate conversations happening in the same room. While this polite disaster unfolds, regular people across southern China are dealing with the fallout of the war in far more practical ways. Fishermen avoid the coast because foreign ships are everywhere. Merchants can't sell anything because trade routes are broken. Villagers hear rumors about foreign devils riding metal whales, which, honestly, is a fantastic description of steamships. But the bureaucracy keeps functioning like a machine built centuries ago, slowly, stubbornly, and completely oblivious to the outside world. Petitions still arrive, taxes still get collected, officials still argue about ceremonial hats. It's almost peaceful how disconnected it all is. The British, meanwhile, continue moving north, not quickly, not aggressively, just steadily, like someone pacing around your house waiting for you to finish getting ready. Every new port they approach looks at the size of their ships, looks at their own defenses, then decides surrender is the most logical lifestyle choice. Eventually, the final terms become unavoidable. Silver reparations, war indemnities, new ports opened, Hong Kong ceded. A treaty written entirely in the tone of, we won the war, so here's the bill. And even then, even as the ink is drying, the Qing court tries one last thing. They tell themselves this is temporary, a small setback, a short-lived inconvenience on the long timeline of history. But deep down, everyone knows the truth. The world has changed. China is no longer an isolated celestial empire sitting above foreign affairs. It is part of a global system now, whether it wants to be or not. And that quiet, reluctant acceptance, that soft surrender to the future, is where we drift next.
The creature finally stepped into full view, and the night itself seemed to hold its breath. It wasn't a beast they recognized, not from stories, not from warnings, not from nightmares. Its body was tall and lean, shaped almost like a man, but stretched too far, as though someone had pulled its limbs in the wrong directions. Its skin shimmered like black stone drenched in moonlight, and its eyes glowed a muted hollow blue, as if they weren't seeing the world, but sensing it. Aiden instinctively stepped back, clutching the token tighter. The heat from it surged through his arm, almost painful now, almost alive. Mira grabbed a broken branch from the ground, but she knew it was useless. Still, holding something felt better than holding nothing. The creature didn't rush toward them. It simply stopped and stared. That stillness was more terrifying than any attack. Aiden felt a pressure in his chest, like the air around him was being squeezed. The creature raised one long, jagged finger and pointed directly at him. The token flared again, brighter than ever, casting a ring of warm light across the dirt. Mira whispered, "Aiden, it's reacting to you, or to that thing in your hand." He didn't speak, couldn't. His pulse roared in his ears as the creature's mouth slowly opened, not to roar, not to scream, but to make a low, vibrating humming sound that felt like it was echoing inside his skull. The token answered with a sharp, piercing tone. Aiden stumbled back, clutching his head. "Stop! Stop!" Then everything happened at once. The creature lunged forward, not attacking, but reaching with desperate urgency, while the token burst into a spinning halo of golden light around Aiden's hand.
The air cracked like lightning, and the ground beneath them split in a thin, glowing line. Mira grabbed Aiden and pulled him away just in time, as a blast of light shot up between them and the creature, forcing the monster to recoil with a hiss. When the light faded, the creature had disappeared into the trees, but the forest wasn't quiet anymore. Leaves shook, branches snapped. Multiple sets of hollow blue eyes glimmered in the darkness. Mira exhaled shakily. Aiden, there's more. He looked down at the token, still glowing faintly in his trembling hand, and with a voice barely above a whisper, he finally said the words they had both been afraid to say. This thing, it didn't just bring one.
The forest went silent in that strange, heavy way. Not the peaceful kind of silence, but the kind that feels like the world is holding its breath right before something awful happens. Aiden's hand shook around the token. The glow that had been bright seconds ago was now flickering, like a candle about to die. But even that weak light was enough to show dozens of blue eyes staring at them between the trees. Not blinking, not moving, just watching. Mira swallowed hard. Okay, we need to move. Slowly. No loud breathing, no sudden... A branch cracked. Not from them. From behind. Mira spun around, heart punching against her ribs. Another creature, shorter, but crouched low, its limbs bent like a spider, crawled halfway down a tree trunk, its head tilted with an unnatural click. Aiden whispered, "They're surrounding us." "No kidding," Mira hissed, backing up until their shoulders pressed together. The token suddenly buzzed, vibrating in Aiden's palm like a trapped insect. The golden lines engraved on its surface pulsed again, this time forming a faint pattern. Circles, overlapping symbols, something ancient and maybe broken. Before Aiden could react, the nearest creature stepped into the light. Its body was twitching now, almost trembling, as if the token's presence was hurting it. The humming sound returned, deeper this time, shaking the leaves overhead. Aiden's chest tightened. "Mira, I think it's warning the others." The creature hissed, a sound like metal scraping stone, and the forest erupted. Dozens of them leapt from the shadows at once. Mira dragged Aiden backward. "Run!" But the ground beneath Aiden lit up again. A ring of symbols flared under his feet, swirling upward like a golden cyclone. The forest dimmed. The creatures halted mid-jump, frozen in place as though time itself hiccuped. Mira could only stare. Aiden wasn't just holding the token, he was activating it. The air cracked around him, swirling light lifting his hair, his jacket, the leaves at his feet. His eyes widened. He had no idea how he was doing it, and he sure as hell wasn't in control. "Aiden!" Mira yelled, trying to reach through the light. "Stop it!" I'm trying!" he shouted back, panicking. The token flashed. Once. Twice. A third time. And then, a wave of golden energy blasted outward, shaking the entire forest and sending every creature flying into the darkness like torn scraps of shadow. Leaves rained down. Silence returned. Aiden collapsed to one knee, panting, the token dim again, almost dead. Mira rushed to him, gripping his shoulders. "Aiden, what was that?" He looked at the token, then at the forest, then at Mira, and his voice cracked as he answered, "I think, whatever this thing is, it didn't choose me. It summoned me."
The forest smelled like burned air and cold metal. Wrong, unnatural. Mira kept one hand on Aiden's back as he tried to steady his breathing, but even she could feel the tremors rolling through the ground in slow, fading waves from whatever blast he'd just released. The trees around them had been bent backward, like something massive had pushed the whole forest outward from a single point. Him. Aiden wiped his face with a shaking hand. "I didn't mean to do that." "You think I don't know that?" Mira whispered, staring at the circle of scorched leaves around them. "Aiden, you nearly vaporized the entire wildlife population." He didn't laugh. He couldn't, because somewhere in the distance, far beyond the trees, something answered the blast. A deep,
echoing sound, a roar, but not animal, not natural. Mira froze. Okay, that did not sound like any of the shadow creatures. Aiden's fingers tightened around the token, though it was barely glowing now. Just a tired, fading ember. Aiden forced himself to stand. We need to leave the forest. Yeah, Mira said, grabbing his arm. Before round 2 of whatever you just summoned decides to show up with friends. But as they started moving, the token suddenly tugged. Not metaphorically. It physically pulled Aiden's hand to the right, like a magnet locking on to something distant. The glow brightened just a little, guiding them toward a narrow path between 2 ancient trees. Mira stared. Oh, great. It's got GPS now. Aiden swallowed. Should we follow it? No, Mira said immediately. Then she sighed. Absolutely not. A beat. But we're gonna follow it anyway, aren't we? Aiden nodded helplessly. It's pulling. So they followed. The forest grew denser around them, the roots twisting like ribs beneath the soil. The deeper they went, the colder the air became. No insects, no wind, no sound except their footsteps and Aiden's uneven breathing. Then, the trees opened into a clearing. At the center was an old stone archway, half buried, covered in moss and markings that matched the ones that had flared under Aiden's feet earlier. The token warmed in his hand. Mira whispered, "A portal?" Aiden shook his head slowly. No, not active, not anymore." He walked toward it, drawn as if the token recognized the structure, like a key sensing a door it had once belonged to. The token lit up again. Just a tiny spark. Mira grabbed his wrist. "Aiden, don't—" But it was too late. The moment the token touched the arch's surface, the symbols carved into the stone flared to life with the same golden glow. A shimmer rippled through the air, and then a voice spoke. Not from the arch, not from the forest, not from any direction. It spoke inside Aiden's head. "Bearer located." Aiden stumbled back, clutching his skull. Mira grabbed him before he fell. "Aiden, what happened? What did it say?" Aiden's voice shook like a loose wire. His eyes widened with terrified clarity. It said— He swallowed hard. It said, "Bearer located." Mira went still. Located by who? Aiden turned toward the forest and saw glowing shapes moving between the trees. Not the shadow creatures. Something taller, something faster, something that had been waiting. And the worst part? The token, for the first time, felt afraid.
The shapes moved with a rhythm that didn't belong in a forest. Too smooth, too coordinated, too aware. Mira tightened her grip on Aiden's arm. "Those aren't shadows." Aiden nodded weakly, eyes fixed on the glowing figures weaving between the trees. Their outlines flickered like they were made of light trapped inside bodies that didn't know how to hold it. The token pulsed, fast, uneven, like a heartbeat in panic. Mira whispered, "Aiden, why does it feel like they're not walking toward us, but homing in?" Because they were. The nearest figure stepped into the clearing. Humanoid shape, but wrong. Way too tall, its limbs elongated, its head tilted at an angle no neck should survive. Its body glowed with the same golden lines as the arch and Aiden's token, but dimmer, unstable, like a candle in a storm. A single eye opened in the center of its face. Not a normal eye, a bright, circular lens of light that scanned Aiden from head to toe. Better confirmed. The voice didn't come from the creature's mouth. It vibrated through the ground, through the archway, through Aiden's spine. Mira swore under her breath. Nope, nope, absolutely not. Aiden, we are leaving. But the creature stepped forward, slow, deliberate, towering over them. The others emerged behind it, forming a loose ring around the clearing. Their eyes lit up one by one. Aiden felt a cold spike in his chest. They're not attacking. Yeah, which somehow makes it worse. The lead construct's head tilted again, trying and failing to mimic a human gesture. Better. The threshold awaits. Aiden shook his head. I don't know what that means. The creature lifted one long arm and pointed at the archway behind him. Activate the threshold. Restore passage. Mira stepped between Aiden and the creature. No, he's not doing anything until you explain what the hell you things are. The creature froze. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, designation, warden system, task, protection of the threshold network. Aiden blanked. Protection? You attacked us before. The creature turned its glowing eye toward him. Negative. Shadows attacked. We responded. You fled. Mira's jaw dropped. Wait, so these things weren't trying to kill us? Primary directive. Safeguard the bearer. Secondary directive. Contain shadow fractures. The token warmed in Aiden's hand, as if agreeing. Mira rubbed her face. Wonderful. Great. So the creepy, glowing skeleton lamps are the good guys. But the creature wasn't finished. It looked at Aiden again. Bearer, your activation surge destabilized the dormant gate. The threshold must be restored before the fracture spreads. Aiden felt the weight of the words hit him like cold rain. I didn't mean to activate anything. The creature paused. Intent irrelevant. The surge originated from you. Mira exhaled sharply. So, what happens if we don't fix it? The warden's eye dimmed slightly, like it was remembering an old nightmare. Collapse. Of what? The warden looked at the archway, then at Aiden. Everything connected to the network. A second warden stepped forward. You must proceed, bearer. Time is limited. Aiden swallowed, throat tight. Mira, I don't think I have a choice. Mira grabbed both Aiden's shoulders and forced him to look at her. You're not walking into some ancient, glowing, possibly murderous gateway alone. If you step through, I step through. Aiden nodded, but fear tightened his chest like a cage. He looked back at the archway. The symbols glowed faintly, waiting, calling. The warden extended a long, flickering hand toward the stone. Bearer, initiate. Mira took a deep breath and whispered, We're about to do something very stupid, aren't we? Aiden whispered back, Extremely. He raised the token. The moment it touched the arch, the entire clearing exploded with light.
Hey guys, welcome back. If you're still awake at this point, congratulations. You're officially stronger than half the diplomats in 19th century China. They fell asleep in meetings constantly. You're powering through an entire empire's emotional collapse. Proud of you. So tonight, let's drift back into the timeline, right where things were getting awkward for everyone involved. Because now, China is losing territory without even fully realizing it. And Britain? Britain is basically doing that thing where someone cleans out your fridge slowly while smiling, and you don't notice until the milk carton is gone. By this point, the British Navy has moved past Canton, past the Pearl River, and is sliding up the Chinese coastline like it owns the place. Steamships humming, cannons polished, officers drinking tea between skirmishes like they're on a mildly inconvenient picnic. Meanwhile, the Qing Empire is experiencing a whole new emotion, delayed panic. Not normal panic, not immediate panic. This is the slow, creeping kind, the one that sneaks up on you like a poorly timed tax bill. Reports finally start reaching Beijing with wording that's just slightly more honest. Your Majesty, the foreigners have taken another city. Still not direct enough, still wrapped in polite phrasing, but less sugar-coated than before. And the Emperor? He's not thrilled. Not yelling yet, just doing that royal deep inhale that means, everyone here is disappointing me. The court starts arguing. Not about strategy, obviously. No one knew enough strategy. No, they argue about blame. Who messed up? Who hid information? Who should have lit more incense? Who offended which ancestor? Classic Qing court energy. But the British fleet? They're not waiting for anyone to finish debating. They keep pushing north, taking forts, custom stations, small islands, everything that looks even remotely strategic. Not because they need them, but because taking things was their whole brand. And every small defeat sends a tiny shockwave through the bureaucracy. Not enough to change anything, just enough to make everyone uncomfortable. Local governors start sending desperate letters to Beijing like, we require reinforcements, we require cannons, we require someone who knows anything about naval warfare. And the capital sends back messages like, remain calm, trust in harmony, do rituals. Super helpful. As the British close in on the Yangtze River, the imperial court finally has to admit, quietly, softly, almost whispering it, that the empire might be in actual danger. They start preparing emergency plans. Not good plans, not practical plans, but plans like move the court further inland if necessary. Because obviously that's going to scare off the British Navy, relocating your palace 50 miles west. Still, even with all this happening, the emperor remains strangely detached, like someone watching smoke drift under a door but thinking, well, let's see how bad it gets. Meanwhile, British officers are literally writing letters home complaining that this war is too easy. One wrote something along the lines of, China seems somewhat unprepared, which is military speak for, are they even trying? And deep down in the bureaucracy, a few tired officials finally whisper the unspeakable. Maybe we should negotiate. Not surrender, not give in, just talk. Softly, carefully, as if diplomacy might bite. But the emperor doesn't want to hear it yet. The court doesn't want to admit it. And local commanders are stuck in the middle, watching British steamships cruise past them like floating metal nightmares. And so, in this strange, floating moment, China is not yet defeated, Britain is not yet satisfied, but both sides can feel the direction of the wind. The treaties are coming, the humiliation is coming, the decades-long aftershock is coming. Slowly, inevitably, like the tide. And in the next part, we drift into the moment where diplomacy finally appears, not as a solution, but as the empire's last remaining option.
Hey guys, welcome back. If you're still drifting with me through this very long, very tired imperial meltdown, honestly, respect. You're basically doing a guided meditation through the downfall of a dynasty. Very niche hobby, but I support it. So let's float back into the story, because we're now entering the phase where the Qing Empire finally admits, not loudly, not boldly, just in a quiet whisper, that maybe, just maybe, they should talk to the British. This realization doesn't arrive like lightning. It arrives like a lazy cloud, slow, soft, and slightly disappointing.
By now, the British fleet is sitting near the mouth of the Yangtze River with the kind of confidence you only get when your opponent still thinks incense can fix geopolitics. They're not rushing. They're not stressed. They're drinking tea on deck like, so, when do we take the next city? After lunch or before? Meanwhile, Beijing is in what I'd call polite panic. Everyone is worried, but they express it in the most bureaucratic way possible. Lots of bowing, lots of whispering, lots of blaming each other in extremely formal language. Finally, someone says the forbidden phrase, "We may need diplomatic negotiations." And the room goes silent, like someone just suggested canceling Confucianism. Because to the Qing court, talking to foreigners is already humiliating. Talking to foreigners who are beating you is even worse. And talking to foreigners who know they're beating you is peak embarrassment. But there's no choice left. The empire is a sinking ship, and the British are casually poking holes in the hull just to see what happens. So the emperor orders negotiators to be appointed. Not the smart ones, not the experienced ones, just whoever looked slightly calm that day. They send the first delegation south. These guys are polite, obedient, very ceremonial, and absolutely clueless about international law. The British negotiators show up with fancy documents, clear demands, numbers, maps, and the kind of smug energy you get after winning a war without breaking a sweat. The Qing negotiators show up with robes, formality, and centuries of diplomatic habits that worked great against Mongolia, but not against a nation that invented industrial cannons. The British open the conversation with, "Here are our conditions," and the Qing negotiators respond with, "Before discussing conditions, we must determine correct seating order." Beautiful. Tragic. Peak Qing. The talks don't go well. Not because of shouting or anger, but because the two sides are basically speaking different languages, even when using the same words. The British want trade, territory, money, and ports. The Qing want harmony, respect, ritual hierarchy, and maybe for everyone to calm down. It's not compatible energy. The British eventually realize, oh, this might take forever. So they return to their ships and casually begin preparing to sail up the Yangtze River, because nothing encourages diplomacy like the sound of cannons being cleaned nearby. The Qing officials panic again. Not dramatically, just quietly, like people who've spilled tea on an expensive carpet. They send another message to Beijing. Negotiations are progressing slowly, which in bureaucratic translation means, please send someone who knows what they're doing. But Beijing doesn't have anyone. The smartest guy, Lin Zexu, is still exiled in some remote corner, probably fishing and wondering why he ever tried to help. So, the emperor appoints a new lead negotiator, a guy whose main qualification is not visibly terrified. He gets on a boat. He sails south. He arrives so tired he probably wants to surrender immediately just so he can go home. And this becomes the atmosphere. Talks starting, failing, restarting, stalling, while the British fleet moves closer and closer to the Yangtze River Delta, the economic heart of China. Each mile the British ships move inland is like a countdown clock, ticking toward the inevitable moment when China will no longer be able to pretend this is fixable. And the saddest part? Most people in China have no idea what's coming. The villages, towns, and markets keep living their normal lives. No one knows that foreign gunships are drifting up their rivers and that history is about to reshape everything. The empire keeps trying to negotiate, the British keep tightening the noose, and the world drifts toward the Treaty of Nanjing. But not yet. First, we have to reach the Yangtze River. We'll drift there in the next part.
And as the dust of history settles over the molasses flood, something interesting happens. The story stops being just a strange disaster and slowly turns into a quiet reminder of how easily a city can forget the small things that matter. The old streets of Boston heal, the molasses is washed away, and life returns to its usual rhythm, but the memory lingers like a faded photograph left in a drawer. people begin to understand that the flood wasn't just about a burst tank or a sticky wave. It was about a system that ignored warnings, rushed construction, and gambled with public safety simply because it was easier. Over time, the event becomes a symbol of accountability, a way for future engineers, lawmakers, and ordinary citizens to point back and say, this is what happens when we stop paying attention. And yet, there's also a strangely human side that grows with every retelling. The survivors who joked about molasses on their shoes, the firefighters who kept slipping while trying to rescue people, the neighbors who helped dig each other out, all of them transformed the tragedy into a shared story the city carried forward. It becomes one of those legends that doesn't need exaggeration because the truth is already unbelievable. And maybe that's why the Great Molasses Flood still shows up in classrooms, documentaries, and late-night trivia, not because of destruction alone, but because it reminds us that history is full of moments where ordinary life suddenly bends into the unexpected, leaving behind a story no one could have invented.
Tonight, we drift into the final stretch of this long, slow unraveling of an empire that once thought it was the center of the world. By the late 19th century, the Qing court had entered a kind of quiet freefall. Not dramatic, not explosive, just a slow-motion collapse where everyone pretended things were fine while absolutely nothing was fine. The dynasty still had its palaces, its rituals, its armies on paper, but the foundation had been eaten away by corruption, opium, foreign pressure, and a bureaucracy that moved at the speed of a tired snail. And somehow, even that was optimistic. China's population was massive, but the government's ability to manage it was shrinking every year. Floods, famine, and uprisings were constant background noise. The dynasty wasn't dealing with crises anymore. It was just reacting to disasters with the same tired routine of send a report, blame someone, pretend it's solved. Local governors cared more about protecting their careers than the country, and the emperor was trapped inside a palace where bad news was filtered until it sounded like a bedtime story. Opium didn't vanish either. Even after the wars, the treaties, and all the political humiliation, opium just stayed in the bloodstream of the empire. It wasn't the dramatic, fiery cause of collapse people imagine. It was more like a fog, a quiet numbing agent. It created a country where reform felt impossible, where weakness became normal, where hope turned into a distant memory. Traders made fortunes, addicts lost everything, and the government collected taxes from a poison it never wanted. And in the middle of it all was a population that had been told for centuries that the emperor would always protect them. But the emperor couldn't even protect himself. When Guangzhou finally tried to reform the system, it was already too late. His ideas weren't bad. They were just a century behind, and the court wasn't interested in catching up to anyone. The conservatives shut him down instantly, not because they feared chaos, but because change meant losing power. It was easier to let the country keep drifting than to risk shaking the table. And so the empire that once built global trade routes, invented paper money, and expanded across half of Asia simply stalled, like a giant machine running out of fuel. By the early 1900s, foreign influence was everywhere. Railways, banks, factories, almost all funded, owned, or controlled by outsiders. Other countries carved out zones of influence like they were dividing a giant pie. And the Qing court watched this happen with the same energy as someone watching their house slowly fill with water, but deciding to first finish their tea. Even the Boxer Rebellion, which could have been a turning point, became another misstep. The dynasty backed an anti-foreign uprising they couldn't control, then paid the price when the foreign powers crushed it. More treaties, more fines,
more humiliation. It was the same pattern, repeating itself, again and again, until it didn't even feel like history anymore, just a loop. When the last emperor, Puyi, took the throne as a toddler in 1908, the empire was already gone in everything except name. His regents repeated the same rituals, issued the same decrees, and held the same ceremonies, but none of it mattered. The dynasty had become a museum exhibit that was technically alive, and the country around it was already moving on. By 1911, the collapse wasn't even dramatic. China didn't explode, it just slipped away from imperial rule. A revolution formed, provinces defected one by one, the army joined the opposition, and the court realized it had no one left to command. And with almost no resistance, over 2,000 years of imperial rule came to a quiet, tired end. The greatest empire in Asia didn't fall because it was conquered. It fell because it decayed from the inside and was too exhausted to stand up again. In the end, opium wasn't just a drug, it was a symbol, a sign that the empire had lost control of its borders, its markets, its people, and eventually its own ability to imagine a future. It numbed the elites who needed to act, drained the population that needed strength, and opened the gates for foreign powers who were more than willing to take advantage. One small plant reshaped global trade, fueled wars, destroyed millions of lives, and helped bring down a dynasty that once seemed untouchable. And that's where we let the story settle tonight. Not on an explosion, not on a dramatic final battle, but on a slow, quiet fade. The Qing Empire didn't end with fire. It ended with exhaustion. And somewhere in that long drift downward, opium played a quiet, deadly part. Just let that thought float for a moment as the lights dim and the last echoes of a fallen empire fade into the background.
And that's where we'll wrap things up tonight. If you're still awake, honestly, I'm impressed. If you drifted off somewhere between the tax reforms and the palace meltdowns, that's totally fine too. That's kind of the whole point. Thanks for hanging out with me in this long, slow walk through history's quiet disasters. If you enjoyed the vibe, go ahead and hit like, maybe subscribe, or just let the algorithm decide your fate. No pressure, it's late. Take a deep breath, let your shoulders drop, and let your mind settle. History's full of noise, but it also has these soft, sleepy corners where stories fade gently instead of exploding. I'll meet you again in the next video, where we'll wander into another tale of royal chaos, bad decisions, and very tired empires. For now, good night, sleep well, and let the past keep dreaming without you.